Of a third private equity fund to invest in healthcare businesses across Asia. And I'm pleased to introduce Abram Mir, who's the managing partner at Quadra Capital, with me here in the studio. Now, we've just been talking about India, and that's actually one of your hotspots for investment.
Absolutely. So, we're very excited to be investing in Asia. We think that Asia is going through a veritable revolution. Underlying all of this, we think that the global center of gravity for the global healthcare industry is shifting very rapidly from the west to the east. The context of that is today, Asia represents about $1.3 trillion in healthcare spend. In about 15 years, by 2030, that'll balloon to about $4.3 trillion. Now, that's a very large number. If you put into context that number, 4.3, is larger than the whole of the US and Europe combined today. So in 15 years' time, healthcare in Asia will be greater than the Europe and the US combined. And we think that'll bring back the center of gravity of the healthcare industry to Asia. And that's why we're very excited to continue to invest in what we think is essential infrastructure for the long-term well-being of Asia.
Well, the demographics are unbeatable. You just have to look at the sheer numbers for places like India, Indonesia, and China. But, you talk about the infrastructure. That's almost the bottleneck for every single type of investment going into Asia, and the biggest risk, no?
True, it is. But, demographics are only a small part of it and actually tell a very small part of the story. The demographic shift between now and 2030 won't be dramatic. What will be dramatic is the increasing affluence. And even worse than that, what will be dramatic is the increase in the chronic disease that's going to burden the region. So today, Asia represents about 30% of the world's population, but represents about 45% of the world's disease burden, and yet only spends around 5% of the world's expenditure. So the fact is that Asia in the old days used to suffer, or Asians used to suffer from dengue fever, from malaria. That's no longer the case. Asians now suffer from many of the diseases that are suffered in the West. So whether it's cardiac, whether it's cardiovascular, whether it's diabetes, whether it's cancer, these very expensive diseases, which become lifestyle diseases, need further investment because they need an ecosystem for treatment. It's not just a case of having a vaccination. It's having a whole ecosystem that needs to be developed in many of these markets to be able to adequately impact the level of increasing chronic disease that's impacting this region right now.
Okay, from an investor's point of view, this has been all about search for yield, search for value. What are your returns looking at?
Well, we're very fortunate that this is our third vehicle, and we're very fortunate that we continue to be supported by some of the world's leading institutional investors, and we're fortunate that they continue to see that confidence. But to cut a long story short, we're about 25% and upwards of IRR, and we continue to be able to beat that. So we think that if we're able to navigate the challenges, because clearly this is a region that still has challenges, but if we can navigate those challenges and ride that wave of growth, we think we can continue to achieve those types of very high quartile returns.
You're not in China because the regulations are just too difficult?
No, we think China is a very unique market. It does have the evolution of its own. It is moving from a very central economy where healthcare is still driven by the state. The rest of Asia is very different. The rest of Asia, frankly, has taken the connotation that they cannot be in a position to be able to meet the healthcare demand, and therefore the private sector is playing a much more important role. For example, in India today, for every 10 beds built in India, 7 are being built by the private sector. And that's even greater in places like Indonesia. That's not the case yet in China.
Okay, all right. Some extraordinary statistics there, and definitely huge potential. Thank you so much for coming on for us. That's Abram Mir, who's the managing partner at Quadra Capital, talking about healthcare investment challenges, but also opportunities in Asia. Those are your business headlines. I'm going to throw it back to Julie for the latest from the SEA Games.